I live in a small town in the mountains, and not just your average small. There are just over 100 people in my city, and I have seen maybe 20 of them. It's about a 30-minute drive in any direction to reach any sort of real civilization, and there is only one road that connects us to any neighboring area. I just recently got a job working overnight in one of these cities, and things have been going okay, but there is one thing to note. The drive to work is fairly dangerous. Living in the mountains has its ups and downs, no pun intended, but the biggest problem about being so secluded is that they don't take care of the roads. There are massive potholes and big stretches of bumpy patched pavement. Additionally, there is no shoulder to pull off to if you have an emergency, just ditches and large drops. To top it all off, there is a ton of wildlife that just walk into the streets at night. From raccoons to possums, coyotes and deer, there's never a night where I don't have to stop for something crossing in the dark. This turns my 30-minute drive into a 40-minute one easily. One night as I was getting ready for work, I was struggling particularly bad with my ADHD. I was leaving things all over the house and struggling to remember to finish tasks that I needed done before I left for work, like my laundry with my work uniform that was still sitting in the washer. My coffee that had finished dripping about 10 minutes ago that I had forgot even existed, and my eggs that were now beginning to burn as I sat there staring at the pan the whole time, just lost in thought. I was finally able to get everything sorted. With my clothes now drying, I sat there drinking my cold coffee and eating my slightly burnt eggs while doom scrolling social medias and getting lost in my mind once again. I finished my meal and put my shoes on, hoping the worst was over. I threw my dishes in the sink, grabbed my keys and headed out the door to my car. I know I had to be careful now. Spacing out and burning my eggs is one thing, but if I do it while driving, it could have way worse consequences. The last thing I needed was to hit a deer or drive myself off a cliff simply because I wasn't paying attention. I sat in the driver's seat collecting my thoughts for a few minutes and trying to rein myself in while trying some meditation techniques I saw on TikTok. Once I was confident that I could make the drive without losing myself, I started my car and took off out of the driveway. It was weird driving while at full attention. I noticed houses that I had never paid mind to, a few churches that I had completely missed before, and even a rock quarry that I had no idea existed. I had somehow completely blocked all of these things out before, but it was kind of nice. It felt like a brand new road. By this point, I was about halfway through the drive and I hadn't drifted into my mind even once. I was feeling pretty good. Maybe I should try meditating more often. Then it dawned on me. I left my work uniform in the dryer. I was so worried about losing focus while driving that I forgot the most important thing I needed for work. I only had one option at this point, and it was to go home and get my uniform. I had to drive for another 5 minutes or so before I could turn around, but on the bright side, I was approaching my favorite part of the drive. It was a long flat stretch of road that ran right through the center of a small town called Evans that was surrounded on all sides by tree-covered mountains. The long flat road reminded me of where I grew up. It was the flattest place you've ever seen, but I loved it. The drive through Evans was very calming to me, and coincidentally it was the only place to turn around after I left my house. I continued driving, and before I knew it I was approaching Evans. I also realized that I had spaced out for the full 5 minutes leading up to it. I was disappointed with myself. I was doing so well the entire drive, but forgetting my uniform at home must have just threw me off. At the very edge of Evans, closest to my house, there was a small mechanic shop that I pulled into to try and meditate a little and turn around. I was doing too well at keeping my focus. I can't let it end now. After a little bit of deep breathing, I started heading home, and all I could think about was how stupid I was for leaving without my uniform. Then it dawned on me. I was spacing out again, and I had literally just stopped to focus myself. I stopped the car just outside of Evans to do some deep breathing once again, and I noticed something strange. I was at the bottom of a very steep large hill that I have no memory of at all, but I have to have been here before. I literally can't have avoided it. There is only one road that leads to my house, and the only other way to work takes me an hour out of the way. I know my attention is bad, but to have missed this massive hill for months seemed impossible to me. I sat there taking in this hill for a while. It was lined on both sides with trees, and there was a single street light at the base. There was something odd about this place, though. It was almost pitch black past the light. There should have been more light than this. It wasn't a full moon, but most of it was illuminated and I could see everything else around me pretty well with just the moonlight. I didn't have time to sit at the bottom of this hill all night though, so I started to drive thinking about how stupid I was for leaving my stuff in the dryer, and before I knew it, the hill was gone. I looked in my rear view mirror and sure enough, the hill was already behind me. What in the hell is going on? There is absolutely no way I drove straight up that thing and missed it again. I made a mental note of a tiny disheveled hut I saw in my rear view as I was driving away so I could remember to stop on my way back and get a better look at this place. There's no way I'd forget that dump of a hut. It was practically destroyed. I was so focused on the rundown hut that I was home before I knew it. I bolted into my house to throw on my uniform and rushed back out to my car. As I made my way back along the road, all I could think about was the hut. The house, the churches, and even the rock quarry took a backseat to this hill. I was so focused on it that I tuned out everything on the drive there that I noticed earlier. I continued down the road, and before I knew it, I had arrived at the small town of Evans. No, there's absolutely no way this is happening. I drove straight past the hut and the hill again like it wasn't even there, but I was looking for it the whole time. I slammed on my brakes and came to a screeching halt right out in front of the mechanic shop and pulled in to turn around. I stopped for a second to focus up. Something weird is happening and I needed every bit of my attention to figure it out. As I sat there replicating the meditation techniques from this morning that seemed to help, the front door of the shop opened. Out of the shop walks this scruffy older man who begins heading up to my car. I rolled down my window to see what he wants. "I'm the shop owner. I saw you pull over awfully fast and you looked worried, so I wanted to make sure you were all right." I didn't want him to think I was some sort of lunatic for being obsessed with this massive hill that I was sure everyone else knew about but me, so I told him that I thought I left something at home and I stopped to turn around and get it. He stares at me with a look of confusion before saying with a grin, "I saw you turn around earlier. I'm sure whatever you left back there is better off that way. You should just keep going." An immediate wave of fear hit me. Was he watching me? I nervously agreed with him and told him to have a good night as I drove off in a hurry. I stopped at a gas station up the road, partially to get gas but mainly to wait out a few minutes before turning around. I know I was going to be late to work, but I just needed to check out this hill. After filling my car with gas and sitting inside it for about 10 minutes, I hopped back on the road and headed for the hill. I normally don't speed, but I didn't want the shop owner to see me going back, so I was flooring it. I glanced over as I passed his shop and there he was, watching me tear past his shop, headed back in the direction of the hill. I felt like a little kid disobeying his parents and getting caught. I was mortified, but I kept going anyway. It was too late to turn around now, and unless I did it in the middle of the road, which I didn't like to do, the only other place I could do it was my house. My mind began to race frantically, thinking about the shop owner watching me. I could feel myself begin to space out, so I hit the brakes and came to a stop. And there it was, the hill that I so desperately wanted to find. I stared at this hill for a minute or two. I was overwhelmed with paranoia at the thought of getting out to explore it. I was so worried that I decided to turn my car around. I pulled over as far as I could, but more than half of my car was still in the street. I proceeded to get out, but I left the engine on and the door ajar just in case I needed to leave in a hurry, and made my way toward the street light. I stopped about 20 feet from the light and just stared past it. The yellow glow of the streetlight barely penetrated the creeping darkness that shrouded the hill. I pulled my phone out to turn on the flashlight, and as I was pulling up the app, something caught my attention. I could smell something strange. It was like roses, cedar, and honey, but there was something foul about it, like a tinge of rotting meat hanging in the air. I started to get a little lightheaded and my stomach became queasy, but I tried to shake the feeling. I turned on the light from my phone and began to make my way past the faint glow of the streetlight into the darkness and toward the hill. Almost immediately after the passing the streetlight, the dim yellow glow had faded. The darkness was so intrusive that the light on my phone was virtually useless as well. I continued onward, trying my best to take in my surroundings, but I could hardly see anything further than 30 feet away without shining my phone directly on it. After walking for a bit, I began to realize just how steep this hill actually was. My legs were already burning and I had only made it about 200 feet up. I pushed forward regardless, but the deeper in I went, the stronger that weird odor was, and the more nauseous and lightheaded I became. I wanted to make it to the top of the hill and check out that hut I saw as I was driving home, but I don't think I can make it all the way up this thing. I gathered what little constitution I had left and kept pushing forward. I was maybe 500 feet in now, and by this point I was already spent. My legs were starting to buckle, and the smell was so intense that I was choking back the urge to gag. I was approaching a bend in the road that I was desperately hoping was the top of the hill. As I began to round the corner, I could see that there was no end in sight. I couldn't keep going. I decided to stop and look around for a bit before turning back though. As I stood there taking in my surroundings, I could see something move at the edge of the road not far ahead. Instantly I remembered the shop owner and how he had been watching me. Had he followed me up here, and if so, how did he get ahead of me without being seen or heard? There's no way, it couldn't possibly be him. It has to be one of the animals out here just crossing the street. I turned my phone toward the edge of the road, expecting to see a deer or at worst a coyote, but when the light found my target, it wasn't anything I had ever seen in my life. Whatever this thing was, it was massive. I stood there staring, completely frozen, as a cold chill ran up my spine. I could feel every hair on my body stand up all at once as my legs began to shake. My brain was telling me to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, and all I could do was stand there and stare at this thing on the side of the road. With the light from my phone, I could just make out what I was looking at. Whatever it was kneeling down, facing away from me, and appeared to be eating something. It had the shape and build of a large muscular dog, but it was easily 7 feet tall and about as wide as my car. There was no visible fur on it, just pale milky white skin with dark patches that I thought was dirt at first, but after a moment it looked more like rotting bits of flesh. I could hear the crack of bones and the ripping of meat from whatever it was eating. My eyes wandered down to the ground in front of this thing to see what was unlucky enough to be its meal for the night, but I wish I hadn't. I could just barely see it, but on the ground in front of the creature was a human body, completely mangled and lying in a pool of blood. Pure unadulterated terror enveloped me, and I could feel a lump in my throat as I bent over, and the entire contents of my stomach violently rushed out onto the road. I let my head hang there as the taste of vomit slowly dissipated before it dawned on me that not only had I made my presence known by loudly spewing chunks in the dead silence of night, but I had also looked away from this thing that was chowing down on a body not even 40 feet away from me. I slowly lifted my head, and as I did, I could see this creature was no longer preoccupied with its previous meal and was now sitting down facing in my direction with its front side in full view. It had a long, thick neck that held up a very large canine-shaped head that sported long, oily black human hair with no eyes or ears, and it was covered in the same pale, rotting flesh as the rest of its body. There was something even more odd. I could see lumps on the top of its head near the hair, but I couldn't make out what they were. As I stood there hunched over taking in this living nightmare, it began to tilt its head down, exposing the bumps on its skull, revealing a face. A human face. The expression on it was imprinted into my brain in an instant. I had the most haunting smile I had ever seen. It was an unchanging and almost pained expression that was being masked with a fake jovial smile with closed eyes that reflected this same sad yet joyful look. I began to stand upright very slowly in an attempt to not antagonize this monster. And as I stood fully upright, I began to back away as carefully as possible, but as I took my second or third step, I could see the creature's blood-stained canine jaws begin to snarl, exposing a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. It rose to its feet and began to lift its head back up before crouching down almost as if it were going to pounce at me. It was in this moment that I had noticed that this thing didn't have paws at the end of its front legs, but instead it had human-shaped hands with long, slender fingers. It cocked its head back before jutting it back out and letting loose the most ghastly noise I have ever heard. It was a low, deep roar at first, but was almost immediately accompanied with what I could only describe as hundreds of hollow human screams. Before it even had the chance to finish its hellish scream, I dropped my phone, turned and bolted down the hill for my car. I was sprinting with everything I had in me. Powered by fear and the sheer steepness of the hill, I felt like I was flying. My heart was pounding harder than it ever had in my life. It was as if someone was playing a drum on my chest, and all I could hear was my heart beating in my head. My mind was racing faster than my legs, going over and over the shopkeeper's words. "It's best if you just keep going. like he knew this thing was up here and thinking about my car that I had left running just in case. All I had to do was make it to my car. For a brief moment I had forgotten about what was chasing me. Was it chasing me? I glanced over my shoulder for a split second to see if maybe somehow I lucked out and it didn't follow. I was wrong. So very wrong. Not only was it behind me, but I could see its haunting, unchanged expression from the face on the top of its head staring me down as it was gaining on me. I could feel a rush of adrenaline as my legs began to move even faster, and I could swear that for a moment my feet weren't even touching the ground and that I was actually running on air. Then I began to feel my legs begging to struggle to keep up with my momentum, and I began to stumble. I had to do something. I can't keep this pace up, and if I fall, this monstrosity would be on me in an instant. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I turned toward the guardrail at the side of the hill, regained my footing and leapt over the edge. The ground disappeared from beneath me, and then I realized just how far the drop actually was. There was no going back now, though, and I stood a much better chance of surviving the fall than I did of outrunning the nightmare entity that was chasing me. The ground began to close in as I attempted to prepare myself for the impact. I relaxed my body and tried to land in a way where I would roll and hopefully not break my legs. As I hit the ground on the side of the hill, I threw myself sideways, but instead of rolling, I smashed into the ground and began to ragdoll. After a couple seconds of being thrown end over end, I smashed sideways into a tree and came to an abrupt stop as the wind was knocked out of me. I laid there gasping for air and frantically scanning the road, praying that the beast hadn't followed me, and I was in luck. It hadn't even crossed the guardrail, but instead it sat down on the edge of the road and stared at me with that closed-eyed face, almost as if it were taunting me. After lying on the ground next to the tree that I had just become best friends with, I was finally able to catch my breath. Evie and Hale was agony, though, and I was pretty sure I had broken some ribs, if not all of them, and I was covered in cuts, scrapes and bruises, but I was alive at least. I slowly clambered to my feet. Keeping my eyes fixed on the terrifying monster on the road above me, I began to make my way towards my car. I inched along in the woods as the behemoth stood up and followed me, keeping pace with my every step like a predator stalking a dying animal, and that's exactly how I felt at this moment. I staggered along the forest for what felt like hours, my eyes locked with my aggressors, and even though they were closed, I could tell it was staring back at me. Eventually, I could see a dim yellow glow out of my peripheral vision, and I knew it was the streetlight. I was almost to my car. There was the problem of my possibly broken ribs, though. I couldn't outrun this thing before, and there is no way I could now. Maybe I didn't have to, though. This thing hasn't left the road the entire time, and I was starting to think it just couldn't leave the hill at all. Or that was the hope anyway. The closer I got to the end of the road, the more nervous I became. What if I was wrong and this thing only stayed on the road because it couldn't fit between the trees, or maybe the drop was too big? It didn't really matter, I guess, because if it wasn't bound to the road, this atrocity would come for me the moment it had the chance. I was only about 40 feet from the street light and could hear my car running. The trees that may have been the only thing keeping me safe ended at the street light, and from there it was about 50 feet to my car. The engine was on and the door was still open, so all I had to do was hop in and floor it. I stopped a few feet from the edge of the woods and waited for a minute, partially from fear and partially to see what this abomination that was stalking me was going to do. It still hasn't looked away from me, and it was still following my every step. After a couple of minutes of waiting, it began to sit down, and without a moment of hesitation, I took off running. This was my best chance, and this thing was certainly just going to wait me out. I sprinted out past the tree line as the pain from my ribs almost made me collapse, but I had to keep going. I looked over to the road, fully prepared to see this thing barreling down at me, but it hadn't moved an inch. It just sat there with its pale, grim face following me, but I wouldn't dare stop. I finished the sprint to my vehicle, jumped in, threw the car in drive, and slammed the pedal down to the floor. With my tires screeching, I looked in my rearview mirror, and it was still sitting there just outside of the glow of the streetlight, watching me drive off. With the living nightmare now out of view, I was safe again and speeding towards the town of Evans. I was in pretty rough shape and needed to go to the hospital, but I fucking made it. I let out a sigh of relief before yelling and cheering, slamming my hands against the steering wheel with joy. I made it! I made it! Evans was in sight and I was so ecstatic to be out of that hell, but then I remembered the owner of the mechanic shop, which was just up ahead. I looked over as I was blazing past, and there he was. Standing outside the front door, he was watching me drive by, and before I was out of view, I could see him gesture. With one finger over his lips, I could tell all he did was say, "Shush." From that day on, I took the only other road from my house to work, and even though it added an extra 2 hours to my drive every day, I refused to go back. I never saw the small town of Evans, that mechanic shop, the owner, or that hill ever again, and if I'm lucky, I never will.